Hello and welcome to Postcolonial Space. I am Masood Raja, and today I will continue my conversation with you about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We have so far covered up to the middle of page 54, and today my hope is to continue from page 54 and 55 on to probably page 56. So let me briefly give you what we have covered so far. So as we started this series of lectures, we learned from the very first page how Freire imagines the world itself, right? And in which the natural tendency, according to him, of all human beings is to try to regain their full humanity, right? To aspire to regaining that. And what precludes them from doing that is an oppressive system which dehumanizes them, which gives us the binary structure of the oppressor and the oppressed, right? Now, the dehumanization system, according to Freire, is unnatural because it is imposed by the outside forces, whereas this desire to be fully human is vocational, it's deeply human. Now, the pedagogy of the oppressed then plays with these two competing forces, right? The oppressor and the oppressed. In the process of doing that, he also discusses at a certain point the nature of false generosity or false charity, which I've discussed, I think, in my second lecture. But what he means by that is that false generosity and false charity is the kind of charity and generosity practiced by the oppressors, which throws, so to speak, crumbs to the people, to the oppressed, without changing the unjust situation or the unjust world in which we exist. And what we also learn in the process is that in an oppressive system, the biggest problem that the oppressed have is that that's the only reality that they know, which they have internalized. So the first project of education then is to, how do we make them realize that they need to think the world differently, and in order to do that, they have to reconfigure the system that they have internalized. So these are some of the things that we have covered, right? And that takes us, which I already talked about when Freire discusses what is the project of his book. And what he says is this book will present some aspects of what the writer has termed the pedagogy of the oppressed. We already talked about it, I think, in my second lecture. A pedagogy which must be forged with, not for the oppressed. And that is the crucial point. It has to be a kind of pedagogy that is forged in solidarity with the oppressed, and it actually must be led by the oppressed, their lived experiences and then their view of reality itself. But that is the project of the book. What it is trying to teach us is how to develop a pedagogy of the oppressed with the oppressed, but not just a pedagogy aimed at liberating the oppressed, but also those who are the oppressors and hence equally dehumanized, right? Now, in my previous lecture, I had talked about how Freire builds into his discussion work of Lukács, right, who was a Hungarian Marxist. And the reason he's using Lukács is because Lukács has this huge book called History and Class Consciousness, right, in which he attempts to answer the most important question in Marxist thought, and that is, how do the workers become conscious of their own exploitation? How is that articulated? How to create alienated labor, from alienated labor to disalienated labor? That is one of the most important books. And Freire is tweaking that, just as Lukács tries to explain how the workers come to consciousness of their own exploitation. And Lukács's approach is pedagogical, because what he's saying is that the party, right, its organizational systems, is the one that encourages the workers to talk about their exploitation, to actually verbalize it, talk about it, but there is an act of pedagogy involved there. And Freire is mobilizing the same educational project of Lukács into the critical pedagogy, and that's why he is discussing it. Now, I have just put a quote, a brief quote on Lukács from Wikipedia, but I highly recommend that you read his book, History and Class Consciousness, and I will post a link to description to the book. So according to Wikipedia, and the reason I always use Wikipedia, some of my colleagues would probably not find it proper. The reason I use it is because it's most easily accessible resource, and you don't have to be part of a privileged university or library to access it, right? Lukács also develops the Marxist theory of class consciousness, the distinction between the objective situation of a class and that class's subjective awareness of this situation. You see, now this is already figuring very prominently in Freire's discussion of objective and subjective approach to reality, right? We talked about it in the previous lecture. Lukács proffers a view of class as an historical imputed subject. An empirically existing class can only successfully act when it becomes conscious of its historical situation. So that is the thing to remember. Just as Lukács is saying, you don't just suddenly wake up one day and become aware of your class identity. It has to be a political act. Similarly, as Freire is arguing in this book, is you don't wait for history to change things. No, history will always default, right, if we let it be, right, on the side of the oppressors. It's only when the oppressed themselves understand reality and then transform it is when history changes, right? There is no passive waiting. And that was the crucial point in Lukács, right? Coming to class consciousness was not necessarily a product of historical movement, right? From past to the present. It had to be acted upon, right? The workers, the proletariat, needed to become conscious of their own situation and then change it, right? So that's why he's going to Lukács. In the previous lecture, I had also talked about this particular quote by Lukács that he mobilizes, right? And I finally found a good translation of it, so I'm citing it here. And what he's citing here is crucial to his own development of critical pedagogy. He says, and it's on page 52, and I read, "We must, to use Marx's words, explain to the masses their own actions, not only to ensure the continuity of the revolutionary experience of the proletariat, but also to consciously activate the further development of these experiences." And that's exactly what Freire is mobilizing, is that pedagogy of the oppressed, one purpose of it is to encourage the masses to talk about, to acknowledge the exploitative condition they are in, because that enhances not just the understanding of exploitation, but also verbalizing it, talking about it, discussing it, will then become a path to developing strategies to counter it. So this was some of the work that we have already done. I do strongly urge you to watch, the other lectures. But I will now move on to, as I've already been doing, reading parts of the text, and then, as best as I can, talking about them. As always, you are welcome to post any questions under this video, send them my way, and I'll try to answer them. Now, please do keep in mind that I claim no expertise in these subjects, right? I just bring to you whatever little I know, right? And the whole idea behind these videos is to share whatever I know freely. but also to become a part of a conversation. So the only way this can be an enriching experience for you as well as for me is if you become part of the conversation. And, do subscribe so that we can stay in touch. All right, so I will move on to today's text, right? And we are starting on page 54. Okay. And I'll read first. The pedagogy of the oppressed, animated by authentic humanist, not humanitarian generosity, presents itself as a pedagogy of humankind. Okay, let's stop here. What is the distinction between humanist and humanitarian? It's pretty obvious if you look at it. Authentic humanist project would be that takes into account, within the logic of Freire's argument, the humanity of the people. Humanitarian, we already know the things that we call humanitarian aid, humanitarian support, which always presupposes that there is a recipient to whom those in a better economic or political situation must deliver certain goods, right? Without altering the situation that creates, the figure of the recipient, right? Presents itself as a pedagogy of humankind. So pedagogy of the oppressed isn't just necessarily for the oppressed. It is the kind of pedagogy that can be transformative for the whole humankind. Pedagogy which begins with the egoistic interests of the oppressors, an egoism cloaked in the false generosity of paternalism, and makes of the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, itself maintains and embodies oppression. So this is a critique of what? Of paternalism. What is paternalism? When one part of a binary relationship assumes the role of a leader, of a father figure, right? And hence dispenses wisdom, materials, goods, charity to the lesser part, right? And that kind of pedagogy is self-centered. So the pedagogy developed by the oppressors is by its very nature paternalistic, because it sees the other, it sees the ones to whom that pedagogy is being delivered as passive recipients, right? But also childlike, right? And it makes the oppressed the objects of its humanitarianism, right? Humanitarianism in a sense where you do not change the structures that create the dichotomous world. You just, throw your scraps at the poor, at the workers, right? Without, and feel good about it maybe, without changing the basic structure of power in which you are in that dominant position and they are in that oppressed position. That is what he calls false generosity, right? This is why, as we affirmed earlier, and I'm reading, the pedagogy of the oppressed cannot be developed or practiced by the oppressor. Okay? By the oppressor means anyone in a dominant position. From a detached perspective, you cannot develop a pedagogy that can be liberating for the oppressed. It would be a contradiction in terms if the oppressors not only defended, but actually implemented a liberating education. Because, their interest is to maintain the status quo, to maintain the system in which they exist. Most of the times they are not even critical of it because they have also naturalized their position in the hierarchy of existence, right? So expect them to create the kind of pedagogy that would actually alter the world, undo their privilege, right, and center the oppressed. And that is what he's pointing out over here, right? So I go on, page 54. But if the implementation of a liberating education requires political power, right? Well, because that's the first question that emerges in one's mind, right? The moment you say, we are going to have a pedagogy of the oppressed must lead their own education and must also transform the world of the oppressor. The first question that emerges is, how can they do that? Because we always assume that to effect positive change in the world, we must have power. I mean, how many of us have not felt like that? I have felt it all the time, like when I have tried to do something in solidarity with others, in solidarity with my students and with my colleagues, I have realized that at a certain point, since we do not have the numbers, you feel helpless because you cannot change much. So we always think that change can only occur when we are in a position of power. How many of us have assumed that role? A lot of us liberals, right? We always think, okay, let me, keep working through the system until I reach a position of power, and then I will change things, right? We internalize this logic that in order to effect change, you need to have power, right? Not realizing, and this is totally on the side, that in the process of rising up within a given closed system, no matter how committed we are to eventually bringing about change, we are trading parts of ourselves in the process of that rise. And by the time we get to the top, not much of us will be left, because we will be pretty much totally, if not totally, most of us will already have been incorporated by the system. And so this, but if the implementation of a liberating education requires political power and the oppressed have none, how then is it possible to carry out the pedagogy of the oppressed prior to the revolution? That was a big question, right? How can we develop it unless we have power? So what it presupposes is that we must first bring about the revolution and then institute the pedagogy of the oppressed. Now he's saying this is a question of the greatest importance, the reply to which is at least tentatively outlined in chapter 4, which we will discuss. One aspect of the reply is to be found in the distinction between systematic education, which can only be changed by political power, and educational projects, which should be carried out with the oppressed in the process of organizing them. This is a really crucial distinction, that when we are thinking of changing the education, we're thinking on systemic level, and we realized we're thinking of the formal education, right? And that can only be changed when you have political power. And he's saying, I'll give a better or a fuller answer to this question in chapter 4. But here, let's first distinguish between two modes of education: the formal systemic educational system, which we cannot change before the revolution, right? And the educational projects, which can be done without state power and which can incorporate pedagogy of the oppressed. Because actually it is here in educational projects that the project of pedagogy of the oppressed, as we will learn, develops, right? So I'll read on, and this was on page 54. On the same page, then he goes on, the pedagogy of the oppressed as a humanist and liberation pedagogy has two distinct stages. What are those stages? In the first, the oppressed unveil the world of oppression and through the praxis commit themselves to its transformation. In the second stage, in which the reality of oppression has been transformed, this pedagogy ceases to belong to the oppressed and becomes a pedagogy of all people in the process of permanent liberation. In both stages, it is always through action in depth that the culture of domination is culturally confronted. Okay. So we already know that the pedagogy of the oppressed is a liberatory project. And now he's giving us two stages. He's already at length discussed the first stage. How do the oppressed come to the realization of reading the reality objectively and understanding their own oppression? But in the first oppressed, they unveil the word of oppression. That is a wonderful use of the epistemological model of ideology, that unveiling, that they must understand the nature of oppression itself. And then through praxis, right? And praxis, remember, is reflection and action, commit themselves to its transformation, to the transformation of the unjust order. And in the second stage, when the world around them has already been transformed, is when they will offer this pedagogy as pedagogy for all people. And remember, that will tie it into the two second most important project of claiming of humanity by the oppressed. First, claim humanity for themselves and liberate themselves. But in the process, not to become oppressors themselves. They must also liberate their oppressors, help them find their humanity. And that's where the second stage comes in, right? But it is always through action and praxis. So reflection, learning, thinking, but then praxis or practice to change things. These are the two stages that he lays down for us on page 54, right? Okay, then he goes on. Page 55. In the first stage, this confrontation occurs through the change in the way oppressed perceive the word of oppression. In the second stage, through the expulsion of the myths created and developed in old order, which like serpents haunt the new structure emerging from the revolutionary transformation. So we already understand that the first stage is pre-revolution, right? This is when the oppressed are coming to realize the nature of their oppression, and they are developing a pedagogy to understand reality and developing actions to transform it, right? And then after they have done that is the second stage, right? What is the second stage? If you look at any revolutionary movement, the biggest fear after the revolution was what? The counter-revolution, right? That the system that you have undone lives, right? And that it comes back to haunt the new established system. How? I mean, let's take the example of the post-colonies. All the former colonies, right, become free and gain their independence, win their freedom. But as soon as they do that, right, since the larger structures of the world in which the colonies existed has not altered, they become then dependent, now indirectly, to the same powers. So a revolutionary breakaway would have been where you become free as nations and then become a part of, an equal array of nations. That doesn't happen. So those dependencies then reappropriate all acts of freedom, take them and make them part of the system. So you become a free India, free Pakistan, free Zimbabwe, but are you really free? Because your strings are still being pulled from elsewhere. Ngugi Thiong'o gives a great example of that, in his Devil on the Cross. You can watch my lecture on it, but also read the book. But so pedagogy of the oppressed then also must cater for that counter-revolutionary movement, right? After the oppressed have changed the system and brought about change, right? So in the first stage, this confrontation occurs through the change, right? The pedagogy of the first stage must deal with the problem of the oppressed consciousness and the oppressor consciousness. the problem of men and women who oppress and men and women who suffer oppression. It must take to account their behavior, their view of the world, and their ethics. A particular problem is the duality of the oppressed. They are contradictory, dividing beings, shaped by and existing in a concrete situation of oppression and violence. Okay? So what we must keep in mind, right? In the first stage is to understand the nature of oppression itself. And how do we understand it? Through the pedagogy of the oppressed. And as we move further in the books, we will learn practically steps to do that. But crucial in this process is that in the stage one, the oppressed must learn of the world in which they exist, how it works, how is their situation as the oppressed, but also the nature of the oppressor. How do they work, right? Because we ought to liberate them as well, right? And then, a particular problem is the duality of the oppressed. What is the duality? They are divided beings, right? Because they are shaped by the system in which they exist, right? And that system has been put in place through violence. Now, that was the biggest problem for Fanon, right? If you've read the beginning of The Wretched of the Earth, right, you know what I'm talking about. And that's why people who claim that Fanon is a prophet of violence don't really understand, because they forget that he was a psychoanalyst. And when he's talking about the trauma of colonial violence, what he's trying to teach us is that you can't talk your way out of it. You have to literally destroy your oppressors, right? But the problem was the same. What his argument was that colonial system is a system of violence, it's put in place through violence, right? Here, in the pedagogy of the oppressed, that is what the oppressed must confront in the first stage, their own location in a violent system, where even their tools for thought and thinking are shaped by that very system. Now, how to escape the logic of that system as you transform it? That's the question. We are still at the first stage, remember, where the oppressed are coming to the realization of their own system. Freire goes on, and he is now describing the system of violence, right? Any situation in which A objectively exploits B or hinders his or her pursuit of self-affirmation as a responsible person is one of oppression. Okay. Such a situation in itself constitutes violence, even when sweetened by false generosity, because it interferes with the individual's ontological and historical vocation to be more fully human. Let's stop there. Objectively exploits, right? What does that mean? That is part of a system in which, without doing anything, I am exploiting someone else. Any system in which that is possible is a system of oppression. How? How can we talk about it? Think of the world around you, right? You and me and all, we can sit in our drawing rooms and talk about humanity and all, but are we objectively part of a system or supporting of a system that exploits us? Absolutely. There are so many of my actions, things I buy, knowing that these are being made by people who are exploited, who do not have many rights. All of that is the system of exploitation, right? That's objective exploitation. And in any system in which one person can do that to another is a system of oppression. So the society, the world in which we exist is an oppressive word. It's a violent word because it interferes with the individual's ontological and history, because it interferes with that by keeping people fixed in place, making them work on slave wages. The system, and me being a part of it, is already creating conditions in which these people may not have the path to their full humanity, right? With the establishment of a relationship of oppression, violence has already begun. You don't have to literally go and beat these people up. We live in a system which already is doing that to people, right? Never in history. So this is the thing, what he's trying to point out is that the system that claims to be generous and kind and shares its resources, it is in effect a system of violences. It's built-in violence, right? And then anytime something goes wrong, we are like, workers have destroyed this and peasants have burned their crops, the violence is always impugned on to the oppressed, without realizing that the system in place is a system kept in place through epistemic and physical power and violence, right? And that's where he's questioning. Never in history has violence been initiated by the oppressed. Initiated, right? Not committed. Initiated. Why? Because they're always responding to a system of violence already in place, right? How could they be initiators, he says, if they themselves are the result of violence, right? If I am a silenced woman, right? If I am a gay person not fully having my rights, if I'm a peasant who doesn't own my own land, if I am a migrant worker on a Texas farm not having access to clean water or even my basic rights, am I creating that violence? No, I am recipient of the violence of the system. How can I be the perpetrator, right? How can I be illegal, right? When the system that's exploiting my labor itself is an illegal system of violence. That's what is. So how could they be initiators if they themselves are the result of violence? How could they be the sponsors of something whose objective inauguration called for their existence as oppressed? I mean, it's just like saying that if the slaves rose against their masters, calling them the beasts, right? Not realizing that it was the slave owners who had created a system in which human beings could be bought and sold as property, could be dehumanized, right? Who were not human, the slave owners, right? There would be no oppressed had there been no prior situation of violence to establish their subjugation. I mean, where do the oppressed come from? It's not like you're born oppressed, you're born into an oppressive system, of course. So he's constantly now driving this thing home, the question of false generosity, but a system in which oppression is created, but that system claims to be humane and claims to be civilized. And he goes on page 55, violence is initiated by those who oppress, who exploit, who fail to recognize others as person, not by those who are oppressed, exploited, and unrecognized. It is not the unloved, I love this sentence, it is not the unloved who initiate disaffection, but those who cannot love because they love only themselves, right? It's not the oppressed who unleash violences, who create hate. It's those who are centered on themselves and create a hateful system, right, who commit violences. It is not the helpless, subject to terror, who initiate terror, but the violent, who with their power create the concrete situation which begets the rejects of life, right? It is not the tyrannized who initiate despotism, but tyrants or tyrants, right? It is not the despised who initiate hatred, but those who despise. It is not those whose humanity is denied them who negate humankind, but those who denied that humanity, thus negating their own as well. Force is used not by those who have become weak under the preponderance of the strong, but by those who have emasculated them. These are like moving passages, right? Because he already is working with that binary structure of the oppressed and the oppressed. But also how the oppressors constantly argue and point to the oppressed as the problem. It's just like blaming the poor for their own poverty. They are lazy, they are violent, right? Well, what he's saying is that who has the power to create a system in which there can be a constituency called the poor and the oppressed, right? And if that system generates and creates this subjectivity, then whose fault is it? Where should we point our finger? At the oppressive system. And that is the first step in the pedagogy of the oppressed, is first of all learning about the unjust system and then dislodging that system from your souls, but also to really saying, we are not the ones causing this problem. It's your system that's creating it. Let's change it. And in the process of doing so, let us save ourselves, but also you, the oppressor, right? And that is what he suggests is the project in the first phase of critical pedagogy. And I'm now going to go to the last paragraph for today's discussion. In affirming Okay, so sorry, I'm going to skip this one because I was supposed to stop here. So this is the last paragraph that we just read, right? So what have we learned then in today's conversation, right? We moved from he teaching us about the nature of pedagogy of the oppressed. And today then giving us a few other things to think about. First of all, that there are two stages to development of critical pedagogy, right? And that to answer the question, how can we change the world and pedagogy if we do not have power, is to make the distinction between formal education and informal education. And that in the first stage, the oppressed will learn about their own oppression, right? And that can be done through educational projects. And after the revolutionary moment is when that pedagogy will also become liberating for the oppressors. And then towards the end of today's discussion, the passages I read, what he's trying to highlight is the dichotomous way in which violence is talked about and mostly impugned onto the oppressed. And where he's saying is, no, let's take it back to its source. If the humans are dehumanized within a given system of power, then those who have the power to do so maintain that power through violence. They are the ones who are creating and actually violently keeping a constituency, a group under their power, right? That is the violent system. But the promise of critical pedagogy is not to go and become oppressors, not to shape yourself in the image of the oppressor, but to create a new way of objective reality, way of being in which you liberate yourself as the oppressed, but in the process, humanize your oppressors as well. So that is today's thoughts on the pedagogy of the oppressed. I will, of course, come back with the next installment. Please do watch these lectures chronologically. I shouldn't even be calling these lectures, these are conversations. And as always, Share your thoughts, your views on it. Send me your comments and let me know what you think about these. I hope these are useful to you. And with that, I will sign off today and I will see you next time. Until then, stay safe, peace and love. Hello, welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Dr. Masood Raja, and today I will continue my conversation with you about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We are still on Chapter 1, and I'm hoping to cover from page 55 to middle of page 57 today. Now, if this is your first time joining us, please do subscribe to the channel so that you can get frequent updates about what's coming next. And within this series, you could watch the previous videos to know where we are. We have already gone through his discussion of the binary structure of power between oppressor and oppressed, the project of critical pedagogy in the first stage. We've already discussed is to make the oppressed aware of their own exploitation, and he comes through Lukács to do that. And then the project of critical pedagogy itself, right, which he calls the pedagogy of the oppressed. So in today's talk, we are moving on to his discussion of what happens in this process in which the initial stages of the pedagogy of the oppressed starts. And as in all these lectures, you know the format. I read the text word by word, paragraph by paragraph, and then I add a few insights that I might have. The idea is to actually read the book with you, right? So I'm going to start on page 56. And here is the paragraph. For the oppressors, however, it is always the oppressed, and then in parentheses, whom they obviously never call the oppressed, but depending on whether they are fellow countrymen or not, those people, or the blind and envious masses, or savages, or natives, or subversives, who are disaffected, who are violent, barbaric, wicked, or ferocious when they react to the violence of the oppressor. So this is the question of violence, right? And in the previous lecture, we had talked about how what Freire is talking about is that since the oppressor-oppressed relationship it is established through the violence, right? When the oppressing class looks at the actions, maybe sometimes reactionary, but rebellious actions of the people, of the masses, right? They don't attribute the cause of that violence to themselves. They capture that violence within the body of the oppressed and make them a cause of their actions, right? And these terms that he's using are very instructive, right? The term violent, right? If you look at the Algerian context, the French, by and large, imagined or posited that the Algerian Arab was essentially violent, right? What that enables them to do is to posit that there are no existential causes for that. People can be naturally violent, right? Some same kind of words are implied here about in the United States by right-wing pundits and scholars even and politicians about Muslims, right? Barbaric, right? These were the terms used by the colonizers, right? About in their African colonies, Asian colonies, because that binary structure enabled them to posit the natives as barbaric, and then they could themselves, retrieve their own identity as civilized, wicked, or ferocious. All these terms were used always for the people who were being controlled by the others, by the dominant group, and we still do that. I mean, if you want to expand it a little further, think of patriarchy. and the patriarchal vocabularies. Any cultures that believe in superiority of men over women, right, always attribute certain negative connotations to women not being smart enough, women being emotional, right, irrational. These were all the terms used to describe women in Europe as well as currently in so many parts of the world. So the oppressing class always employs these vocabularies to designate, in a way, the oppressed class, but to also posit that they, the oppressed class, are themselves naturally violent and hence need stronger control, right? But they never think that any violence, semiotic or material, that might be coming from the oppressed could have been caused by the very system that the oppressors themselves have maintained, right? And that is what he's talking about here. I'll move on to the next passage, which is on page 53. Yet it is paradoxical, though it may seem, precisely in the response of the oppressed to the violence of their oppressor, that a gesture of love may be found. Consciously or unconsciously, the act of rebellion by the oppressed, in parentheses, an act which is always or nearly always as violent as the initial violence of the oppressors, can initiate love. Let me stop here, right? And he's saying this might sound paradoxical, but a rebellious act by the oppressed, right, to overthrow the oppressing order, even though the oppressors themselves would see it as violent, would see it as cruel, can be an act of love. How? Let's read on, right? It can initiate love. How? Whereas the violence of the oppressors prevents the oppressed from being fully human, the response of the latter, that is the oppressed, to this violence is grounded in the desires to pursue the right to be human. As the oppressors dehumanize others and violate their rights, they themselves also become dehumanized. As the oppressed, fighting to be human, take away the oppressor's power to dominate and suppress, they restore to the oppressors the humanity that they had lost in the exercise of oppression. Now note, this is a permanent theme, in this book of Freire. The question about how to forestall against the possibility in almost all historical revolutions in which the formerly oppressed themselves become an oppressing class. How to stop that from happening. But here what he's also theorizing and talking about is that this act of rebellion by the oppressed can initiate love. How? Because the system against which they are rebelling is a loveless system, right? It's a master-slave system. But if they can dismantle the system, what they have dismantled is the dehumanizing aspects of it. Now remember, we've already learned while reading Freire that in the process of dehumanizing others, the oppressors themselves are dehumanized. They're part of that dehumanizing system. So when the oppressed rise up to liberate themselves, part of their mission is also to liberate their oppressors. And as the initial step, this act of rebellion becomes an act of love, because not only does it free the oppressed, but it also frees the oppressors from the logic of the very dehumanizing system that they themselves had created, right? Thus giving them their humanity or a chance at humanity. Think of it historically. I mean, if you look at the American South, the slave owners, right? They maintained their lifestyles all underwritten by, the labors of the slaves. But in the process, could you imagine someone who owns other human beings as a fully realized human being? They would feel like that within their own system, right? But from looking from outside. So when that oppressive system is overthrown, right? Not necessarily just by the oppressed, after all, there was a war. So what that renders is a new humanity for the former slave owners when they adapt to this new system in which they have to acknowledge that no human being can own another human being and his or her labors, right? That is their path to humanity, right? Because then, now, it would have been worse, the rebellion, if it had come from the slaves. It would have not rendered the same results of freedom, liberation, and humanity if the former slaves had overthrown their oppressors and then made them slaves, right? Now that would have then perpetuated the same logic, right? The same system that Freire is teaching us how to learn to avoid it, right? Let's go to page 57. Now, how do the oppressed free the oppressors? It is only the oppressed who, by freeing themselves, can free their oppressors. The latter, as an oppressive class, can free neither others nor themselves. It is therefore essential that the oppressed wage the struggle to resolve the contradiction in which they are caught, and the contradiction will be resolved by the appearance of the new man, neither oppressor nor oppressed, but man in the process of liberation. If the goal of the oppressed is to become fully human, they will not achieve their goal by merely reversing the terms of the contradiction, by simply changing poles. Now, we've already talked about what this contradiction is, right? Contradiction is the agonistic system of oppressor and oppressed, right? And the oppressed live in it, right? But here again, he is highlighting this important aspect of it, is that only the oppressed can free themselves and their oppressors. Because the oppressors have no reason to change the system. They probably can't even see it critically. They have internalized the logic of it. We are superior. These people who serve us are inferior. That's their lot in the life, right? It's the oppressed who, first of all, must become conscious of their own oppression. And in the process of overthrowing the system of oppression, intentionally also liberate the oppressors, because that system will be destroyed. But in the process, a new kind of human being must come into being, right? Not a dichotomous human being, not a binaristic human being, right? Not a human being who models his or herself on the model of the oppressive system itself, but someone who can liberate his or herself, but also liberate those who had oppressed him. This was crucial, right? Remember, in early work of Fanon, Black Skin, White Masks, when you read it towards the end, where he's talking about, I want a new kind of humanism, right? Where he talks about this profound way of thinking humanity in which there are neither slave owners nor slaves nor former slaves, right? This is in the same vein, right? The idea of creating a kind of humanity through praxis and liberation, who frees the human who frees his or herself, but does not become oppressive, right? A lot of people have read Marx and Deleuze and Guattari and Lukács, all these Marxist scholars, to answer this question of how to make sure that post-revolutionary movement, post-liberation, the oppressors themselves, the oppressed themselves do not become the oppressed. I mean, Deleuze famously calls it the possibility in impossibility, that we have to at least imagine that. Here, I mean, if we read Freire carefully, there is a pedagogical answer to that, and that is that that's not going to happen by accident. We must train ourselves, right? The oppressed must learn it themselves and then teach it to us, right? But the liberation The full realization of their humanity will only happen when they become new kind of humans, humans who are themselves free, but who also free those who had oppressed them and do not reproduce the same logic and the same system. That was page 56. Okay, I'm moving on. On page 56 and 57 to describe the nature of oppression. You know, what is oppression? And he says, this may seem simplistic. It is not. Resolution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction indeed implies the disappearance of the oppressors as a dominant class. However, the restraints imposed by the former oppressed on their oppressors so that the latter cannot reassume their former position do not constitute oppression. Okay, this is crucial. In the previous paragraph, what he's trying to tell us is that we must forestall against the possibility that post-liberation, the oppressed themselves may not become the oppressors, right? But he's qualifying that, right? It's not a free-for-all. After you have changed the political order, the dichotomous order, the agonistic order of oppressed and oppressors, like after you have overthrown your oppressors, right? The actions that you take now as the newly emergent dominant class, the actions that you take to make sure that no one can replicate the older system or create the same dichotomy of oppressor-oppressed, those actions post-liberation, he says, are permissible, right? They do not constitute oppression. Why? An act is oppressive only when it prevents people from being more fully human, right? That is the basic kernel of understanding an oppressive act. Like anytime we tell someone you cannot do this, right? You're a woman, you cannot fly a plane. You're gay, you can't be in the military, right? That is when we are basically telling someone that something inherently about them precludes them from being fully human, right? So what he's saying is that post-liberation, any law or act that makes sure that no one can reassume the roles they had in the former oppressive order or replicate that itself, it does not constitute oppression. The only thing that constitutes as oppression is an act, a law, actions that make someone else's humanity impossible, someone's realization of full humanity impossible or difficult. Accordingly, he says, these necessary restraints do not in themselves signify that just as yesterday's oppressed have become today's oppressors. Acts which prevent the restoration of the oppressive regime cannot be compared with those which create and maintain it, cannot be compared with those by which a few men and women deny the majority the right to be human. Okay, so again, Freire is nothing if not precise, right? So what he's saying is, and think of it this way, a lot of people talk like this. Oh, what if the workers become, the determinants of their own destiny? What will happen to the mill owners, right? And what Freire is saying is that telling the mill owners that they cannot accumulate all the capital and then keep the labor, enslaved is not repression, right? It's not oppression. It is actually, in a way, an act of love, which is making sure that the very system that we came out of cannot be replicated again, cannot resume again, right? So this is where I'm going to stop. So in today's conversation about Paulo Freire's chapter 1, what we've basically covered is he has already gone through introducing to us the different stages of pedagogy of the oppressed. But the main concern in today was how to resolve the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, that agonistic relationship, right? How to ensure that the oppressed themselves do not become the oppressors. But then he goes on to teach us that an act of rebellion against an oppressive system itself is an act out of love, but because what it does is it frees the oppressed, but also forces the oppressors to rethink the system in which they exist, to become part of a newer, equitable and just system. And by doing that, by incorporating them into that, it's an act of love because they also become fully human. Furthermore, what he's trying to suggest is, in order for any liberation movement or praxis to succeed, the oppressed must not themselves become the oppressors. Their model of defining and practicing their humanity cannot be based in the older order. We talked about it in the previous parts of this lesson, right? And he makes sure to also qualify that any laws, actions, or acts performed by the formerly oppressed to make sure that the old order cannot reassert itself, cannot be perpetuated, the unjust, dehumanizing order, those cannot be considered oppression. And an act, according to Freire, becomes oppressive only when it hinders, prohibits, right, stops someone from seeking their full humanity, right? Now, do keep in mind that there is, a romantic humanism at play over here. And maybe after we have finished this chapter, we'll talk about that. Why is it problematic now for us post-Derrida, post-Foucault, right, post-anti-humanism, to think that centered human beings? So that was problem in Marx as well, right? So we'll talk about that, but we have to keep how Freire is thinking humanity on this core essential level, and that human struggle is always innate desire to be fully human, to be free. So I'm going to stop here. I hope this was useful to you. As always, if you have any questions, concerns, please send them my way. And please also feel free to post your comments, because they allow me to think about these things differently. We also now have a learning website, where you can go and maybe sign up for some courses that will help us sustain this venture and others. And also, please do subscribe. And as always, I'm grateful that you're part of my life, and I'll be back with more on Freire. And until then, thank you. And as always, peace and love. Hello, and welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm back again today for another installment of my conversation with you about the pedagogy of the oppressed. And as I've already mentioned previously, the whole project here is to actually read the book and talk about it. So that's why the progress is so slow. And I apologize for that, but I think it's a book that we need to read carefully and then talk about. So today I will start where we had left in my last lecture, and that means we are still on page 57. And in these pages, Freire is trying to theorize and talk about the nature of the revolution itself, right? How do the oppressed first liberate themselves, but in the process liberate those who had previously oppressed them? But how do they make sure that their ascendance, the ascendance of the oppressed in itself, does not create a dichotomous relationship between them becoming the oppressors and the former oppressors becoming the oppressed? That's the question that he's trying to handle in these pages. And as always, I will first read and then briefly talk about it. I'll pause here also to encourage you to please subscribe to the channel so that you get occasional information from us whenever something new is posted. And also, if you have some time, do visit our new e-learning website. There is a video explaining it on my channel, but see if there is something that you like there and that you can register for and support us. The website is masoodraja.com. It's called Cross-Cultural Learning. Thank you so much. So I will now go to read the next passage, and I'll slightly touch upon the passage that we had discussed in the previous lecture. So what he was talking about is that what he's saying is, it might seem simplistic that there is going to be a negative response from the formerly oppressor class whenever the oppressed change the system, right? And it is understandable. And he says beyond that, on page 57, he says, however, the moment the new regime hardens into a dominating bureaucracy, the humanist dimension of the struggle is lost, and it is no longer possible to speak of liberation. Now, there is a footnote here where he's going to explain what he means by bureaucracy, and I will read it. The footnote says, this rigidity should not be identified with the restraints that must be imposed on the former oppressors so they cannot restore the oppressive order. Rather, it refers to the revolution which becomes stagnant and turns against the people using the old repressive bureaucratic state apparatuses, right, which should have been drastically suppressed, as Marx so often emphasized. So the fear of that counter-revolution, right, where the revolution is led by the masses, led by the people, but is appropriated by a power system which becomes equally as oppressive and destructive. Look at the French Revolution, look at the Iranian Revolution. These were all the revolutions appropriated by a dominant class, and they themselves, Russian Revolution, the same thing. So I continue reading. Hence, our insistence that the authentic solution of the oppressor-oppressed contradiction does not lie in a mere reversal of position, in moving from one pole to the other, right? That we can't just make the oppressed the oppressors and everything would be good. Nor does it lie in the replacement of the former oppressors with new ones who continue to subjugate the oppressed, all in the name of their liberation. So first of all, it does not, the solution to changing the oppressor-oppressed dynamic does not lie in a solution where the oppressed now become the dominant group and start oppressing their former oppressors. Nor does it lie in a third group coming in, riding the wave of popular resistance and then speaking in the name of the people and becoming another dominant oppressive group, right? Both these scenarios do not, in his words, they are not truly authentic and humanistic, right? And we have talked about his romantic notion of the authentic and being human. And I read again, but even when the contradiction is resolved authentically, and the contradiction is the oppressor-oppressed contradiction, by a new situation established by the liberated laborers, the former oppressors do not feel liberated. And this is crucial. The regime that was in power, that has been overthrown, they are not going to feel liberated because the workers have somehow ousted them, right, supplanted them. On the contrary, they genuinely consider themselves to be oppressed, conditioned by the experience of oppressing others, right? Any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression, and this is crucial. Whenever a revolutionary class or a popular class replaces the privileged regime, whatever changes they might bring, right, if they are geared towards enabling more and more people to become fully human, or an equitable system, the regime that has lost its power, its people, its members will see those instances as their own oppression. And why? Because they are only used to living within that privileged location, the rights that they had, the things that they had arrogated to themselves, whatever they could get away with, the privileges that they had. Now, if those privileges are no longer available or made available to more people, right, then to them, then it comes across as if the revolutionary group, the laborers, are taking away from them and giving it to the other. Because in their consciousness, the formerly oppressed have not yet realized that the system that they lived on was itself unjust and oppressive, right? So how does, for here is a great example of it. Conditioned by the experience of opposing others, any situation other than their former seems to them like oppression. This is the former oppressors. Formerly, they could eat, dress, wear shoes, be educated, travel, and hear Beethoven. While millions did not eat, had no clothes or shoes, neither studied nor traveled, much less listened to Beethoven. Any restriction on this way of life in the name of the rights of the community appears to the former oppressors as a profound violation of their individual rights. Although they had no respect for the millions who suffered and died of hunger, pain, sorrow, and despair. For the oppressors, human beings refers only to themselves. Other people are things, right? So this is the crucial thing. If a revolutionary movement, replaces the formerly oppressed class, what the oppressors, formerly oppressor class, what they don't realize is what underwrites their privilege, right? Because they have internalized it. They have somehow assumed that they, have the right to all those privileges and the world owes them to them. They never stop to think that their privilege was underwritten, right, by the suffering of millions of people. And this is not so far removed from reality. This is not theory per se. Think of the world around us, right? There's a famous analogy that one of the authors uses, I'm forgetting his name, who says that the world is like a dog, right, with a fluffy tail. The dog is starving, right? And it's most of the world. The fluffy tail is the richer parts of the world, the North Atlantic regions and all, right? And the problem is that the tail thinks that it can still survive even if the dog is sick and dying, right? Now, these people who have this privileged location in the world, a privileged lifestyle, they think that they have earned it. And if you even ever talk to them that, hey, let's take some away from you so that we can make the world equitable, they would actually feel like they're losing what is inherently theirs, right? That's the feeling that he's talking about here, of the formerly oppressed class. And I will keep reading. And part of the reason they can think like that is the thingification of the others, right? That at a certain level, the oppressor class always imagines that their humanity is somehow more superior, right? And all the other people can be instrumentalized to their purpose, or maybe their lives are not that important, right? And they internalize that logic. For the oppressors, there exists only one right, their right to live in peace, over against the right, not always even recognized, but simply conceded, of the oppressed to survival. And they make this concession only because the existence of the oppressed is necessary to their own existence, right? So the oppressor class, or if we call it the oppressor consciousness or mentality, internalize that they have the right to resources, whatever, maybe they think they have earned it, right? And they do not concede or accord the same rights to the oppressed class. They just give them the right to survival, right? living on scraps. I mean, think of the world around us, right? No one talks about making an equitable and just world. Even if you look at all the neoliberal economists and their political mouthpieces, what do they promise us in the end, right? That, all right, we will bring you jobs, but those jobs are not going to change your life, but you'll be able to make a living, right? While the same people are not concerned with making a living, right? Their actions support torturous regimes, their actions, financial decisions enable people to oppress people everywhere in the world, right? So the only thing that is offered to the oppressed, to the precariat, right, to part-time workers, to the daily laborers, is a promise of survival within the given system. Nothing more than that. And that's the logic that the oppressor group has internalized. And that's what comes to crisis, will come to crisis when the workers, when the formerly oppressed rise up and try to change the system. Now I continue reading. This behavior, this way of understanding the world and people, which necessarily makes the oppressors resist the installation of a new regime, is explained by their experience as a dominant class. Right? I mean, partially, since they have internalized the logic of their own position within a given economy or polity or culture, right, their resistance then comes from that, it stems from that, because they genuinely believe that they are the one who should own the mode of production and have everything as it used to be, right? Once a situation of violence and oppression has been established, it engenders an entire way of life and behavior for those caught up in it, oppressor and oppressed alike, right? Think of it. Any system of oppression, any system that has a regime, it then forces people, right, to live according to whatever station is granted to them in that life, right? So if you are from the oppressor class, you will then assume certain powerful positions, you will have certain resources, there are certain things that you can do, and within that system the oppressed already have an assigned role. They can be servants, they can be farmers, they can be slaves, they can be peasants, right? And it is that precarious balance on which that system exists. Most of the times it is kept in place through oppression, right, through force. But if you have read your Antonio Gramsci and Althusser, you also know that it is also done through hegemonic means, right, by either creating an illusion of the willing consent of the people, right? But that system stays intact, right? And it creates both these subjectivities of the oppressor and the oppressed. And I read on. Both are submerged in this situation, and both bear the marks of oppression. An analysis of existential situations of oppression reveals that their inception lay in an act of violence, initiated by those with power. This violence, as a process, is perpetuated from generation to generation of oppressors who become its heirs and are shaped by its climate. This climate creates in the oppressor a strongly possessive consciousness, possesses of the world and of men and women. Think of it. Look at the slavery in the South. Now, these are well-meaning Christian people. So they had commodified human bodies, bonded them in slavery. They traded them in the market. But the system was so deeply entrenched that they could not imagine a life without owning slaves, because their economy depended on it. So it created a subjectivity called the slave. What did it generate then? A whole system of trade, right? People capturing the slaves in West Africa, people transporting them for profit, right, to the Caribbean and from then to United States. People selling the slaves in the slave market. This entire dehumanizing system, who initiated it? The Africans didn't come to, the southern plantation owners and say, we would like to be slaves. No, it was deeply initiated through the violence of a group of people who had the power and resources to declare that using other human beings as their property, as slaves, and trading them as property is okay. It can be justified in Christian theology, whatever, right? That's what he's talking about. And that mentality, that consciousness is generational, right? It can be passed on to the next generation that has lived in the same privilege. So when the upheaval comes, what were they fighting for in the South? Yeah, okay, it was states' rights and all. We have different euphemisms for that. But to protect the right to own people, because their economy depended on it. They couldn't see, right, their fellow human beings, the African slaves, as equal human beings. And then the latent racism that still exists, the obvious racism, it relies on that historical recovery of that memory of once having been superior to the black people, right? That's where racism comes from, a fear, right, of looking at someone different from you and realizing that they are your equal, right? And the denial of that equality, right? That's what he's talking about. And this possessive consciousness is the consciousness which the oppressing class would then assume that they can own things, they can own people, that's their right, that's how things have been done, right? Apart from direct, concrete, material possession of the world and of people, the oppressor's consciousness could not understand itself, could not even exist, right? Because its understanding of itself is totally contingent upon people it can instrumentalize, people it can own, places it can own, things that, you detach it from that ownership, that possessiveness, there will be a vacuum, right? What are these people going to live for, right? What are they going to do, right? And that denial of what they formerly owned to them is kind of a denial of their extended identity, right? Because it depends on that. It depends on that inequality, hence the resistance to change, right? Fromm, Eric said of his consciousness that without such possession, it would lose contact with the world. The oppressor consciousness tends to transform everything surrounding it into object of its domination. The earth, property, production, the creation of people themselves, time, everything is reduced to the status of objects at its disposal, right? This is another way of saying is that that quote from Fromm comes from Eric Fromm's The Heart of Man. It's a 1966 book, and there's a footnote there. So the logic of the oppressor possessive consciousness is that they think that they have the right to instrumentalize people, instrumentalize nature to their purpose, right? And so resistance to change then comes from this consciousness, not simply because they are losing what they owned, but because without that ownership that defines their identity, their social identity, there's a vacuum. What are they going to be if they can't have slaves? Who's going to do like everyday chores? Who's going to work in the fields? Who's going to take care of their children? There's an entire dependency system that relies on the labor of the poor, on exploitation of the poor. I mean, think of it in America, that's the argument people give. Every time someone says we should have a livable daily wage, hourly wage, the business leaders, right, they come, oh, we will go bankrupt, it will destroy businesses, that means it will destroy jobs, right? What is it that they are arguing for then? I mean, if you look at it carefully, their interest, their dependence is connected to labor being cheap. So if they can only be profitable when my and your labor can be cheapened, what kind of a business model is that? But that is what they always say. Oh, if we raise the minimum wage, businesses would fail, right? Which is an exact acknowledgement of the fact that the businesses need cheap labor to succeed. How do you keep labor cheap? Keep them precarious, give them less rights, don't let them unionize, don't even let them know that they are exploited, right? But the moment you shift that system, people who are dependent upon, consciously and materially, on exploitation of others, right? They are the ones whose social and individual identities come to crisis, right? Think of it, any culture, wherever there is a dominant group, right? Especially dependent on the labor of the poor, right? The undocumented, women. If you start an initiative to teach the women of their rights, to tell the undocumented how to get work, right? These people will immediately pillory you, because it's not just that you are trying to change the system, but you're hitting them exactly at the very place where their survival lies, where their identity lies, right? Because their identity is connected to exploiting others, right? I'll just read another paragraph. This is fun, right? And we are at page 58, by the way. In their unrestrained eagerness to possess, the oppressors develop the conviction that it is possible for them to transform everything into objects of their purchasing power. Hence, their strictly materialistic concept of existence. Money is the measure of all things, and profit the primary goal. For the oppressors, what is worthwhile is to have more, always more, even at the cost of the oppressed having less or having nothing. For them, to be is to have, and to be the class of the haves. I'm going to stop here. So, oppressive consciousness that he is talking about is a possessive consciousness, and it is driven through the logic of material gain. An oppressor group doesn't just want to have power, they also want to have power to extract more wealth, to constantly increase it. Their understanding of their privilege is materialistic. So the profit motive becomes a justifying principle. You only look at how profitable your company is, how profitable your business is. And if you're making more money and your business is more profitable, you can convince yourself that you're doing well and you're a successful human being. In the process, what will fall by the wayside is how you're treating the people. Who are you exploiting? How are you exploiting them? Because that is not what has a bearing upon your actions. It's the profitability of your venture, profitability of your business. And that defines your humanity. But it also makes you dependent on a system of exploitations. And your success always depends upon having more, possessing more, right? And that divides the world into haves and have-nots. And it's always at the cost of others. Think of it this way. My wife once worked for a company that specialized in making certain things, right? Which they sold. Totally useless things, but people bought them, right? And the guy who owned the company had moved his entire manufacturing to China. And when he would negotiate the price of an item, he will even negotiate that he would pay 5 cents less than what the workers were asking for. That's how deeply those who rely on profit motive, how deeply they would cut into whatever little is given to the workers, right? And that's a mentality everyone has. Like those who are in the dominant position, they always want to extract more work from the workers. They want submission. And they always want a bigger return on their investment. And then they internalize this idea of benevolent capitalism, where they can assume this idea that they are creating jobs, right? Not realizing that without the people who are producing the commodities, who work, who labor, capital Maybe the speculative capital will make some money by itself, but without the commodities, without the work of labor, where are they going to take that money, right? So that's the logic he's talking about. So in these 2 pages, from middle of 57 to 58, we are still, Freire is still on the dynamics of post-revolutionary interactions between the formerly oppressed and the oppressors. And he's giving us this instruction into understanding the oppressor consciousness, right? Its very connection to material possessiveness, its connection to exploitation of others, and that its internalization of this idea that simply because you're from a dominant group, you deserve better and you have the right to possess more things, and that it's okay in the process. So many people are exploited, right? Some people do it consciously, but most people internalize it unconsciously. If they are in a privileged position, they don't even acknowledge it, they don't even think about it. They just assume that these people around them are there to serve them, right? Think of it. Have you ever run into a person like that, a person who walks into a restaurant? It doesn't even have to be far-flung parts of the world where there are cultural hierarchies. Here in the United States, a person who looks at restaurant workers differently, treats them differently, thinks of them differently, a person who looks at part-time workers differently, and then if you bring in race and gender and sexuality, it gets further accentuated. All these people, are part of that constituency that has internalized that they deserve to be served because they are materially successful, they have more wealth, and that other people are there to serve them, right? And it's okay if they are poor. It's probably their own fault, right? There are so many different justifications that they use. So that's what he's talking about, the question of purchasing power, and that the dominant group has it, and those who are oppressed, they don't. And that's the dynamic that the oppressor group would like to keep in mind, because within the logic of power in which they exist, they have arrogated that right to themselves. So that's all I have today. I will be back with another lecture on the same chapter 1. We are still on chapter 1. Thank you so much for joining me. And as always, if you have any questions, please send them my way, and I'll be happy to answer them. And I'm grateful that you all respond to these lectures and appreciate them. As always, please do subscribe, and please do check our learning website. I would love to have your support there. Thank you so much. And with this, until the next time, goodbye. Hello, and welcome to Postcolonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and today we'll start or continue our conversation about Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. We will begin from bottom of page 58 and then move on to page 59. Now, if you recall previously, the last paragraph that I had read to you and we had talked about it was about he going into the oppressor consciousness, right? And he starts an explanation of the oppressor consciousness. Now, I strongly request you to go and watch part 8 of this lecture series, in which we explain it, and I will put it up there, for you to click on it. But there is something different I'm doing in this video, and that is that I will be combining my face-to-face discussion with you, and then wherever I read, I will go into a screen recording mode. So I hope that works. If it doesn't, let me know. And as always, please do subscribe to the channel, because I would love to have your support. So here we go, reading the next passage, still at the bottom of page 58, as a continuation of Freire's discussion of the oppressor consciousness. And after I read, I will explain it a little. So you can see that we had left the last lecture somewhere here, right? And we are still talking about the possessor consciousness. So we are still on the bottom part of page 58, and starting here, what he says is, and I read, as beneficiaries of a situation of oppression, the oppressors cannot perceive that if having is a condition of being, it is a necessary condition for all women and men. This is why their generosity is false. Humanity is a thing, and they possess it as an exclusive right, as inherited property. To the oppressor consciousness, the humanization of the others, of the people, appears not as the pursuit of all humanity, but as subversion. I go on. The oppressors do not perceive their monopoly on having more as a privilege which dehumanizes others and themselves. They cannot see that in the egoistic pursuit of having as a possessing class, they suffocate in their own possessions and no longer are. They merely have. For them, having more is an inalienable right, a right they acquire through their own effort with their own courage to take risks. If others do not have more, it is because they are incompetent and lazy, and worst of all is their unjustifiable ingratitude towards the generous gestures of the dominant class. Precisely because they are ungrateful and envious, the oppressed are regarded as potential enemies who must be watched. Okay, so think a little about what I just read, right? Because he's explaining the dominant possessor consciousness. And this consciousness is something which we have previously learned that it is inherited. And it has already internalized a certain logic of its own privilege. And that is what becomes their worldview, right? So whenever, if the peasants rise, if the oppressed rise and try to change the system to the oppressor consciousness, to the possessive consciousness, that comes across as an integral threat to their collective and individual selves, right? Because here is what they think, right? What they think is that they are the ones, even if they don't rationally talk about it, they think that they have the right to life more than the others, that they have earned it, right? And that if they have gotten somewhere, and if they are rich and prosperous, it's because they are more innovative and they work harder than others. These are all the rationalizations, latent and blatant, that they use, right? And because the oppressed have risen and are asking for more rights, since that challenges their individual and collective identities, so the rationalization that is given is, first of all, that these people are ungrateful. We have done so much for them, but there is no way we can make them happy. And two, they are undeserving, because the poor are poor because they didn't work hard. It's their own fault. So that blaming the victim's mentality is at play, right? Now remember, Freire is trying to teach us to understand the oppressor consciousness. And look around you in the world. There are protests going on right now in the United States, right? People who are in solidarity with African Americans, because let's not forget, this fight, these protests are about how African American bodies and humans are treated by power on the streets, right? Now, people who are in sympathy with that, in solidarity with that, it doesn't matter what your race and color or ethnicity is, are in solidarity with it because they have somehow undone their oppressor consciousness and have realized that humanization for all is actually a good thing. People who have reactionary responses to that, including the current US president, right? What kind of argument is that? The same argument that these people, it's their own fault, they are violent, right? So, that these people are violent, it's their own fault, they don't work hard enough. Almost all the racist arguments from the dominant group are based in that, which relies on blaming the victims. While the same people posit their acquisition of things and possessions as something positive, because they are the ones who keep the economy going, right? And this idea that they somehow have the absolute right to have more. And what he's trying to say is that that is also dehumanizing, because in the end these people become just possessors of things, and they develop this tendency of inanimating things, including human beings. I mean, think of these CEOs and people who come and say, I can turn this company around. I mean, how many times have you read that story? Such and such company hired a CEO and he turned it around and make it profitable. What does that involve? It always involves looking at workers as inanimate things, as producers of labors. And then most of the times the first step they take is fire a lot of people, because their idea of those people is as inanimate people, right, whose lives could be impacted by their decisions. But since earning a profit in itself has become a noble pursuit, they have internalized it, right? And that gives them a sense of their own humanity. So that's what he's talking about. And then the idea of policing the victims of this aggressive system, right? Constantly, not only are the poor and the oppressed posited as undeserving, lazy, but they are also posited as a threat. And an entire edifice of security state is built around them. And the idea that they need to be constantly watched, and that permeates the oppressive consciousness. It's not just the state that does that. I mean, if you look at United States cities, right, most poor areas are more heavily policed. The logic is, well, that's where more crime is. But since there is more police there, right, more and more arrests are made in the same area. Right? And you always blame the victims as if policing can solve the socio-economic problems. Think of how dangerous it is to internalize that consciousness. The two men who killed Mr. Aubrey, they had internalized this idea that not only as private citizens of United States, they can become police in the justice system, but they can only actually also kill someone if they think that that person, in their view, is doing something illegal or wrong. Or if you want to go to the Floyd killing, right, of that policeman who did that, what creates a person like that? Obviously, you don't read a book and become like that. You must have internalized this idea that you're somehow superior to the person you're killing right there in front of the cameras. You must have thought of them as not human, right? As less than you. That gesture, it speaks of that. But think of it in the process, what happened to that policeman, right? He himself stopped being human, because what he did was an inhuman, cruel, cowardly act. And think of the dehumanization of that police officer, right? That there are people filming him and telling him, this person is suffocating. But that had no impact on him. That's the level of dehumanized dominant consciousness that Freire is talking about. in the passage that I just read. So the work of critical pedagogy can't just be scratching at the surface. How do we dislodge that terrible thing being that the oppressor class, the dominant class, has internalized? Right? Sorry, I'm getting emotional at this, but this book, what it's talking about is not in the past, right? It's right here in our lives, as you, me, and everyone else lives in this world and dies in it. These things are still happening. We still have not been able to dislodge the oppressor, the possessive consciousness here in the United States. And we still haven't learned from the oppressed to change the system. I'll keep on reading. I'll just probably read another passage and then stop today and then continue this chapter in the next lecture. Page 59, and I'll read a little more. It could not be otherwise, right? And this is that, I'll explain it. If the humanization of the oppressed signifies subversion, so also does their freedom. Hence the necessity for constant control. And the more the oppressors control the oppressed, the more they change them into apparently inanimate things. This tendency of the oppressor consciousness to inanimate everything and everyone it encounters in its eagerness to possess unquestionably correspond with the tendency to sadism. So after this passage, he will give us a brief explanation of sadism, right? But as I was talking about earlier before I read this passage, is that this tendency to dehumanize others, to make them into things, is a deeper part of dominant oppressive consciousness. And one purpose of liberating the oppressors then is to dislodge this from themselves, right? Because it's so far deep in their consciousness, and there are so many rationalizations and justifications that they have learned, that to undo is not an event, it's a project. So as I was talking about the current situation in the United States, you see that oppressive consciousness at play in the statements that are coming out from the right-wing media and the politicians and the President of the United States. I mean, think of it. Think of Mr. Trump. What is he as a human being? A person who is in his entire life has not been answerable to anyone, who has pretty much done whatever he wants, said whatever he wants. Now that is what appeals to his followers. Why? Because they think he's honest, he's not afraid of anything, right? But that is exactly the kind of consciousness that is not needed in this moment of crisis, right? What is needed is someone who can leave the edifice of self and look at the world from the point of view of the other, right? From their point of view. And only then will a person like this with such immense power would effect some change. But it is not going to happen, because that oppressor consciousness, because of his wealth, because of his now power, right, is so deeply constituted that identity. And his followers who invest in that kind of identity, what are their arguments also? They are also the ones who think the poor are lazy. They are also the ones who have racist views, who have sexist views. So the change then would come through a long-term pedagogical project. But the way he refers to sadism at the end, where he's going with that, and I will read more and explain more with next lecture, is that one aspect of psychological sadism is that you treat the body of the other as a thing, right? And that's what he's talking about, that that the consciousness, the oppressive or oppressor consciousness is sadistic, right? And acknowledging that is the first step for me, for you, and for the oppressed in the project of liberating ourselves, but also the oppressors. So that's all I have today. Thank you so much for joining me. And I'm hoping to conclude chapter 1 at least in the next couple of lectures. But as we know, this is an unusual series because we're not just merely talking about Freire. We are actually reading Freire and talking about what he's saying and hoping that he can still teach us something transformative, something that can give us hope and enables us to change the world. All right, thank you for being with me, and I am delighted that you give me your support, you lend me your support, and I will now see you next time. Until then, peace and love. Hello, welcome to Post-Colonial Space. I'm Masood Raja, and I'm back today again with yet another conversation about Chapter 1 of Paulo Freire's Pedagogy of the Oppressed. Now, if you recall, in the previous conversation, we had reached a point in reading the book where he is talking about the kind of psychological relationship, the psychology of the oppressor-oppressed relationship, where he talks about as to how the oppressor's relationship to the oppressed is sadistic, right? Now, in today's reading, he briefly first explains what he means by that. And then he goes on to invoke and talk about yet another constituency in this struggle, right? In this struggle between the oppressed and the oppressors. And this is the constituency that breaks away from the oppressing class and joins the oppressed, right? Now remember, these people figure prominently in all revolutionary theorization and decolonization, as well as in Marx, the question of where would the loyalties of the petty bourgeois lie, right? And he goes on to explain what kind of problems they will have if they do not change their consciousness. These people who have left the dominant group and have joined those who have risen against the oppressors. And then towards the end of today's reading, he will talk about, the violence amongst the oppressed themselves, right? How is it that the natives, the peasants, sometimes are so extremely violent to each other, right? Take it out on each other, and that will help us explain these stereotypes that are mobilized against African Americans in United States, against the native people of India, Pakistan, and elsewhere. What the British used to say, oh, these people are terrible to each other, right? All of these things become clear in this reading today, right? So I'm going to stop here and go to the screen recording of the reading and then come back and we'll talk about it a little more. So here we go. The pleasure in complete domination over another person or other animate creature is the very essence of the sadistic drive. Another way of formulating the same thought is to say that the aim of sadism is to transform a man into a thing, something animate into something inanimate, since by complete and absolute control the living loses one essential quality of life, freedom. Sadistic love is a perverted love, a love of death, not of life. One of the characteristics of the oppressor consciousness and its necrophilic view of the world is thus sadism. As the oppressor consciousness, in order to dominate, tries to deter the drive to reach the restlessness, to search the restlessness and the creative power which characterize life, it kills life. More and more, the oppressors are using science and technology as unquestionably powerful instruments for their purpose. The maintenance of the oppressive order through manipulation and repression, the oppressed as objects, as things, have no purposes except those their oppressors prescribe for them. Given the preceding context, another issue of indubitable importance arises. The fact that certain members of the oppressor class join the oppressed in their struggle for liberation, thus moving from one pole of the contradiction to the other. Theirs is a fundamental role and has been so throughout the history of this struggle. It happens, however, that as they cease to be exploiters or indifferent spectators or simply the heirs of exploitation and move to the side of the exploited, they almost always bring with them the marks of their origin, their prejudices and their deformations, which include a lack of confidence in the people's ability to think, to want, and to know. Accordingly, these adherents to the people's cause constantly run the risk of falling into a type of generosity as malefic as that of the oppressors. The generosity of the oppressor is nourished by an unjust order which must be maintained in order to justify that generosity. Our converts, on the other hand, truly desire to transform the unjust order, but because of their background, they believe that they must be the executors of the transformation. They talk about the people, but they do not trust them. And trusting the people is the indispensable precondition for revolutionary change. A real humanist can be identified more by his trust in the people, which engages him in their struggle, than by 1,000 actions in their favor without their trust. Those who authentically commit themselves to the people must re-examine themselves constantly. This conversion is so radical as not to allow of ambiguous behavior, to affirm this commitment but to consider oneself the proprietor of revolutionary wisdom, which must then be given to or imposed on the people, is to retain the old ways. The man or woman who proclaims devotion to the cause of liberation, yet is unable to enter into communion with the people, whom he or she continues to regard as totally ignorant, is grievously self-received. The convert who approaches the people but feels alarms at each step they take, each doubt they express, and each suggestion they offer, and attempts to impose his status, remains nostalgic towards his origins. So the passages I've just read start from yet another deeper explanation of the oppressor-oppressed relationship, right? Which is, according to Freire, a sadistic relationship. And of course, he is going through like a certain specific understanding of sadism. And if you look at it, I mean, even like in traditional sense, a sadistic act is aimed at controlling another body and seeing it completely submit, right? And that's the consciousness that the oppressor inhabits. In the process, you know, what he's trying to say is that people and their bodies become objects because it's the writ of the oppressor that must be written upon them, right? That's why that relationship is sadistic, and that's why love of that kind is also sadistic, a love that constantly must objectify the other or the beloved or the person with whom you have a relationship. Then he goes on to theorize one of the most important aspects of revolutionary politics, and that is the role of the petty bourgeois, right? That was prominent in Marx as well, because the question, first of all, was where would they stand? Like the shopkeeper, the business managers, these people who were not the workers, not part of the proletariat, but probably not also part of the dominant group. And their loyalties were always, you know, in question. But it was important to know where would they stand in a revolutionary moment, right? And Freire is creating a space here to include those people who might have previously been part of the group of oppressors, right? But might move in solidarity from their privileged status to the cause of the oppressed. And it's really crucial to understand that role, because in our everyday politics, even today in American streets, not understanding that can damage any movement, right? Because if we are fighting for race rights, right, if we don't understand that gestures and participation by people who apparently might look like they are part of the oppressive class, we cannot foreclose the revolution to them, right? We have to include them. But what is there in this text instructive about the consciousness of the people who have just left the house of the masters and joined the oppressed is that they are still caught within the logic, the way of thinking, the psyche of the oppressor, right? So they might have joined the people, but they have this nostalgic view of their own past, but also their way of thinking the world is managerial. It's still connected to where they come from. So then what they tend to do is they tend to appropriate the revolution, right? And how do they do that? By becoming cautionary, by telling people, oh, we must not do this, we must not do that. And all of those suggestions are proffered and offered for the success of the revolutionary movement, but they are not informed by the feelings and experiences of the people that they are joining, right? So what Freire is absolutely certain about is that these people are acceptable within a peasant movement and other movement, but they should come with humility. They should come to work with the people, to learn from them, and not to impose their own worldview and their own way of doing things on the people. People will express themselves in solidarity with each other as they see fit, as is constructed through their learned experience, right? And so, but these passages give us an understanding of any kind of revolutionary praxis, that it must have a space for those who want to come and join it, right? Even though if they were part of the oppressor group, right? So it creates that possibility, it doesn't exclude them, right? But it also tells us to be extraordinarily aware of the incipient and maybe unconscious loyalties and ways of thinking of this group. This group is in an ambivalent space. They've just left the life they had always known, but they have not yet learned to think things through the way the oppressed think, right? Meanwhile, as we are already learning in these lectures, that the oppressed are also learning to dislodge the master's discourse from their souls, right? But these passages teach us, that these converts, they will have problems. They might try to hijack or overtake the movement or try to guide it according to what they think is right, but they need to be cognizant of the fact that this revolution is led by, thought by, and practiced by the oppressed themselves. So this is not just out of thin air that Freire is pulling it out. I mean, if you look at all the major revolutions, towards the end of every revolutionary movement, a cadre of the oppressor group does join the fight, right? It happened in the French Revolution, right? It happened in the American Revolution. It happened in Afghanistan, post-Soviet war. But what ends up happening is that these people who join the revolution late most of the times then get to set the agenda, right? And in a way then appropriate a populist movement to their own ambivalent agendas. And that is what Freire is trying to teach us about, to keep in mind in any kind of revolutionary praxis, right? and to remember that these people who have just joined you, they might be welcome, but their souls carry the imprint of the system that they have just left, and it just can't immediately be erased, and to be cognizant of that. So that's kind of my take on these two passages. There was a footnote 13 here. As you read it, you will see that he's quoting One-Dimensional Man by Herbert Marcuse, and I do suggest you read it. I will go ahead and read a few other passages now. I do apologize that my recording system has kind of given up on me, so I'm using my phone to record these lectures, so I may not be able to put up the text on the screen, but I hope that you can follow it. So I will read the next couple of passages, and then we'll talk about it. Okay. So going on, conversion to the people requires a profound rebirth. Those who undergo it must take on a new form of existence. They can no longer remain as they were. Only through comradeship with the oppressed can the converts understand their characteristic way of living and behaving, which in diverse moments reflect the structure of domination. One of these characteristics is the previously mentioned existential duality of the oppressed, who are at the same time themselves and the oppressor whose image they have internalized. Accordingly, until they concretely discover their oppressor and in turn their own consciousness, they nearly always express fatalistic attitudes towards their situations. So this is an instruction to the newly converted to the movement, right? Is to understand that just as they have left the house of the master and joined the movement of peasants or workers, right? They have a lot of learning to do. The most important thing that they need to learn is to unlearn their own way of thinking, right? And through comradeship and companionship, learn the way of thinking and practicing of the oppressed themselves. 2, also keep in mind that the oppressed are also trying to fight the system that created their consciousness. We already talked about it in the earlier discussions of the text, is that the world that in which the oppressed are rising is the world dictated, scripted, and created by the writ of the oppressor. And that is the logic that the oppressed had internalized, that duality of they themselves, but also the imprint on that soul is that of the oppressive system. So the fight, first of all, is to dislodge that system from your own soul, from your own consciousness, and then come up with new revolutionary praxis, right? So while the converts are coming to this constituency, they should try to learn to be like their oppressed brothers and sisters and learn their ways of thinking, but also keep in mind that the oppressed themselves are constantly still fighting the deep system that had etched on their souls, right? The writ of the oppressive system. And then Freire gives us a quote from a peasant that he had interviewed, right? The peasant begins to get courage to overcome his dependence when he realizes that he is dependent. Until then, he goes along with the boss and says, what can I do? I'm only a peasant. This is that fatalistic way of thinking, right? If you have internalized the logic of the powerful system around you, then the question of changing it never really emerges, because you have somehow agreed that this is your space in this world, right? So the first change must come in realizing that you are oppressed. And we talked about it in the previous discussions, right? And then finding a way of undoing that. So fatalism then is always a part of group or individual consciousness when you cannot imagine a system outside of the one in which you live, or when there is no hope, or when you're isolated and individual, right? And as he will go on to tell, religion plays an important role in it. Any kind of ideology that tells you you must suffer through and do what you're told makes you fatalistic because you transport the result of your life to either a hereafter or to a future time and hope for history to fix things. And anyone who believes in praxis and revolutionary politics would tell you is that history doesn't really solve things. It's people's actions that change things. So that's where he is going with it, right, in this part of the chapter. So I read on. When superficially analyzed, this fatalism is sometimes interpreted as a docility that is a trait of national character. Fatalism in the guise of docility is the fruit of an historical and sociological situation, not an essential characteristic of a people's behavior. It almost always is related to the power of destiny or fate or fortune, inevitable forces, or to a distorted view of God. Under the sway of magic and myth, the oppressed, especially the peasants who are almost submerged in nature, right, because they work with the land, see their suffering, the fruit of exploitation, as the will of God, as if God were the creator of this organized disorder. So this is, his reading of fatalism, but distinguishing that fatalistic thought is not essential. No group is born as a fatalistic group, right? The fatalistic behavior, this belief that things are the way they are, is socially constructed, right? Socially engineered. I mean, think of it, and who essentializes fatalism? I mean, think of the colonizers. Famously, the British, when they talked about the Kashmiri people, they would consider them, there was a term used for them which was called zulm pasand in Hindi and Urdu, which literally means that these are the people who love cruelty. So they had essentialized the behavior of people of Kashmir Valley as people naturally docile, anyone can conquer them. And in the last 20 years, we have learned that no, given the right set of circumstances, the same docile people will rise against their oppressors and fight them to death. So there is no natural docility, right? But most of the times the oppressive system would posit a group identity of such sort on this people, right? Religion plays a huge role in creating fatalistic thought, right? If you tell people this is your station in life, and that if you perform the duties, whatever God tells you to do, you will have a wonderful hereafter or a wonderful rebirth, or Jesus will come and save you. All of these are, the opiates, as Marx would say it, that encourage people to try to change things because maybe religiously you think God has already ordained it, or materialistically you think this is how the world is, this is an unjust world, fighting against this injustice is futile, let's just live our lives in it. And another form of fatalism is where people will say, well, I'm not concerned with politics, I just want to take care of my own family and my own children. And that is another form of fatalism which tells you, as long as I can take care of these few people, I'm doing okay with life. So what does fatalism do? I mean, fatalism forecloses any possibility of revolutionary change, right? It forecloses any possibility of coming together in solidarity, talking to each other, learning from each other, and saying we need to change things. Because if you're fatalistic, you cannot imagine change, because you have internalized this idea that things are the way they are naturally. But what he's also trying to teach us in this passage is that fatalism is not essential. People are not naturally fatalistic, human beings especially, but even animals are not fatalistic, right? Otherwise they won't venture out when there is a drought and try to find a greener pasture, right? They even believe in action, right? But these are some of the things that he's talking about, how, people can be fatalistic. Right? I read on, right? And we are on page 62 now. Submerged in reality, the oppressed cannot perceive clearly the order which serves the interests of the oppressors whose image they have internalized. Chafing under the restrictions of this order, they often manifest a type of horizontal violence, striking out at their own comrades for the pettiest of reasons. And this is where Freire is going into explaining the internal violence within the oppressor class. And this is something extremely important for us to learn, because most of the times the oppressor groups essentialize these violences. These Africans, they have been just killing each other for centuries. If you look at Israel-Palestine conflict, the same phrase is used. Oh, these people have been fighting for centuries. Muslims are violent by their very nature. Hindus are fatalistic. All of these, and within the American context, even the President of the United States sometimes would lead you to believe that somehow African Americans are naturally violent to each other, right? They keep killing each other. Here is where he is trying to now explain how does internal violence emerge in minority groups, in oppressed groups. And what he's trying to teach us is that this violence where the natives, the minorities, the peasants, the oppressed turn against each other is the very product of the system that has created those inequalities. And please do keep in mind, right, there's a lot of Fanon over here. I don't know if he read Fanon or not, but when Fanon explains violence, right, the native violence against each other, this is the same logic. The injustices of the colonial system combined with the psychological trauma is what creates that subjectivity. The same argument is also offered in so many other circumstances under colonies, where men who felt powerless within the public sphere would turn on their own families, right, in their households, because they felt empowered. The idea is not to forgive that violence, but to offer a genealogy of it. What creates a situation in which people who should otherwise be comrades turn against each other and become violent to each other. That is what he's trying to explain in these next paragraphs. And I think it's really important for us to learn that and understand that. And I will come to it in my next conversation with you on this topic. And I hope by then I will have my system sorted out and I'll be able to produce a better quality of video. But anyway, that's all I have today. If you have any questions, concerns, please send them my way, and I'll try to answer them. As always, I'm grateful for your time, and please take a few moments and do subscribe to the channel. Also, we now have a learning website, masoodraja.com, which I've been trying to promote here. Please visit the site and see if you can support us, see if you can take some free courses. That would help this channel and help my cause a lot. Thank you so much for all of your help. I will now see you next time, and until then, as always, peace and love.